The American dream is often sold as a white picket fence and a patch of green grass that belongs entirely to you. But for millions of people living under the thumb of a homeowners association, that dream is a carefully managed illusion. You don't own your home. You own a privilege that can be revoked, fined, or managed by a group of neighbors with too much time on their hands. My name is your name, and this is the story of how a 12-inch piece of polyester started a civil war in a place called Liberty Estates, and how I used a gallon of paint to bring a bureaucracy to its knees. To understand why I did what I did, you have to understand the antagonist of this story. We will call him Steve. Steve is the president of the Liberty Estates HOA board, a position he has held for 15 years. Steve doesn't have a hobby. He doesn't travel. His entire identity is wrapped up in community standards. Steve is the kind of man who walks the sidewalk at 6:00 a.m. with a clipboard and a digital caliper to ensure that no one's hedges have grown more than a quarter-inch past the approved height. For years, the neighborhood lived in a state of low-level fear. People would scramble to pull a single dandelion from their lawn if they saw Steve's silver SUV rounding the corner. He wasn't just a neighbor. He was a self-appointed sheriff in a world of beige siding. I moved into Liberty Estates 3 years ago. I wanted a quiet place to work and a backyard for my dog. For the first 2 years, I stayed under the radar. I kept my lawn mowed, my trash cans hidden, and my exterior lights in the approved soft amber spectrum. But everything changed on a Tuesday in July. My grandfather had passed away recently. He was a veteran, a man who believed in the symbols of this country. In his honor, I bought a small, modest American flag. It wasn't a giant banner. It was maybe a foot long. I placed it in a heavy ceramic planter on my front porch, nestled among some petunias. It looked peaceful. It looked right. The first warning of noncompliance arrived 48 hours later. It wasn't a knock on the door or a friendly phone call. It was a cold, laminated sheet of paper tucked into my mailbox. It cited Article 4, Section 9. No unapproved signage, banners, or exterior attachments shall be visible from the common areas. I looked at the flag. I looked at the notice. I thought, surely, this is an automated mistake. I emailed the board, explaining that it was a small memorial for my grandfather. I expected a sorry for your loss, keep the flag response. Instead, I got an email from Steve's personal account. It was 1 sentence long. The rules apply to everyone, regardless of sentiment. Remove the violation by Friday or face a $50 daily accrual fine. That was the spark. I am a patient man, but I have a very low tolerance for bullies who hide behind paperwork. That Thursday night, I attended the monthly HOA meeting at the local community center. I walked into a room filled with about 20 elderly residents and the 5 board members sitting on a raised dais like a Supreme Court. When it was my turn to speak during the open forum, I stood up and held up the small flag. I asked the board, can someone explain to me how this small symbol, hidden behind my petunias, threatens the integrity of this neighborhood? Steve didn't even look up from his notes. He simply said, it's about the slippery slope. Today it's a small flag. Tomorrow it's a political banner. Next week it's a neon sign. If we make an exception for you, the uniformity of Liberty Estates collapses. You have 12 hours left. I looked around the room. Most of my neighbors looked at their shoes. They knew Steve was being ridiculous, but they didn't want to be his next target. I realized then that I wasn't going to win by appealing to their hearts. Steve didn't have one. I was going to have to appeal to the only thing he respected, the rule book. I spent the next 14 days in a state of obsession. I downloaded the entire master covenant and restrictions of Liberty Estates, all 212 pages of it. I printed it out and laid it across my dining room table. I went through it with 3 different colored highlighters: blue for things I could do, red for things I couldn't, and yellow for the gray areas. I discovered that the HOA had thought of almost everything. I couldn't build a fence higher than 4 feet. I couldn't park a boat in my driveway for more than 4 hours. I couldn't even have a bird feeder that held more than 2 pounds of seed. Steve had spent 15 years closing every loophole he could find. But as I reached the section on exterior wall maintenance, I noticed something strange. The rule book was obsessed with additions. You couldn't add a porch. You couldn't add a shutter. You couldn't add a flag bracket. but maintenance was defined as the act of preserving what was already there. Under Section 12.4, it stated, "Homeowners are required to maintain the painted surfaces of their residence to prevent chipping, fatting, or peeling. Failure to maintain a fresh coat of paint will result in a mandatory repaint order." Then I looked at the color palette appendix. It was a list of 15 colors with names like Morning Sand, Pebble Path, and Dusty Cedar. However, at the very bottom of the page, in a font so small I needed a magnifying glass to read it, there was a tiny disclaimer. "The following colors are suggested for maximum property value. Deviations from this palette require Architectural Review Committee, ARC, approval only if the change constitutes a material alteration to the neighborhood's character." I called a friend of mine, a high-stakes litigation attorney. I asked him, "If the rules say I must maintain my paint, but the color list is only suggested, and they haven't defined what material alteration means in a legal sense, what happens if I paint my house a pattern?" He laughed for a solid minute. "In this state," he said, "property rights are king. If they didn't explicitly ban patterns or specific non-suggested colors in the legally binding bylaws, they can't stop you mid-act. They would have to sue you after the fact, and by then, the statute of aesthetics would kick in. If you finish the job before they get an injunction, you've essentially created a prior existing condition that is incredibly hard to litigate." It was time to go to work. I didn't want to just paint my house a different shade of beige. I wanted to make sure that every time Steve stepped out of his front door, he saw exactly what happens when you push a man too far. I wanted a mural. I wanted a statement. I wanted the stripes. I contacted a specialized painting crew from the city. These guys didn't do suburban houses. They did street art and corporate murals. I showed them a photo of my house and a digital mock-up of the American flag draped across it. I told them the blue field of stars would cover the entire left side of the second story, and the red and white stripes would wrap around the garage and the main entryway. They told me it would take 48 hours of non-stop work and would cost me a fortune in high-durability exterior enamel. I told them price was no object. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about the principle. The logistics were like a military operation. I had to wait for the perfect moment. I knew Steve was going to a regional HOA conference in another city for the weekend. He was leaving Friday morning and returning Monday afternoon. That gave me exactly 72 hours to transform my home. Friday, 7:00 a.m. Steve's SUV pulled out of his driveway. I watched from behind my curtains. The moment he turned the corner, I sent a text message. "The Eagle has flown, move in." Within 30 minutes, 3 industrial paint trucks pulled into my cul-de-sac. 10 men jumped out. They didn't look like house painters. They looked like engineers. They began power washing the siding, drying it with industrial blowers, and masking off every window with surgical precision. By noon, the house was a flat, brilliant white. It acted as a giant canvas. By Friday evening, the neighborhood was starting to notice. People walking their dogs would stop and stare. My neighbor across the street, a nice guy named Bob, came over. "Hey man, doing some renovation?" he asked, looking at the dozens of rolls of blue tape. "Just some maintenance, Bob," I said, handing him a beer. "Steve told me I needed to keep the exterior fresh. I'm just being a good neighbor." Saturday morning was the blue phase. The crew used a laser level to ensure the field of stars was mathematically perfect. They didn't use stencils. They hand-masked each star. By sunset, the upper left quadrant of my house was a deep, midnight blue. The contrast against the white was startling. I could see curtains twitching all down the street. The HOA snitch line was probably melting down, but Steve was 500 miles away, and I had blocked his number. Sunday was the blood phase. The red stripes began to appear. This was the most visually aggressive part of the process. As the painters ran the Old Glory red across the garage door, a group of 3 neighbors, all board members, gathered on the sidewalk. They were whispering and pointing. Eventually, Mrs. Gable, the board secretary, walked up to the edge of my lawn. She looked like she was about to have a physical crisis. "You can't do this," she shrieked. This is a violation of the aesthetic harmony. We will have you evicted." I walked down to meet her, holding a copy of the 15-page legal brief my attorney had prepared. Actually, Mrs. Gable, Section 12.4 says I have a duty to maintain the paint. Section 18 says patterns are not prohibited unless they contain commercial advertising or profanity. This is neither. This is a tribute. Are you telling me the Liberty Estates HOA is officially against the flag? She stammered, her face turning a shade of red that almost matched my house. It's the scale. It's too much. Take it up with the architectural committee on Monday, I said with a smile. But by then, the paint will be dry. Sunday night was a war of nerves. The crew worked under floodlights to finish the final stars. I didn't sleep. I sat on my porch, watching the house transform. It was no longer a house. It was a giant, three-dimensional piece of malicious compliance. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. Monday morning, 9:00 a.m. The painters packed up their trucks and disappeared. The neighborhood was silent, but you could feel the tension in the air. About a dozen neighbors were standing on their porches, waiting. We all knew what was coming. At 10:15 a.m., Steve's silver SUV turned the corner. He didn't even make it to his driveway. He slammed on his brakes in the middle of the street, leaving skid marks. He sat in his car for a full 3 minutes. I imagined him staring through the windshield, his entire world of beige and gray being shattered by 13 stripes and 50 stars. He exploded out of the car. He didn't even close his door. He ran across my lawn, waving his clipboard like a weapon. He was hyperventilating. "What have you done? What is this? I will sue you into the Stone Age." I stood up from my lawn chair, took a slow sip of coffee, and handed him a folder. "Good morning, Steve. I trust the conference went well. I took your advice. I realized that my small flag was a violation of the attachment rule. So I removed the attachment and decided to simply maintain the exterior walls as per your strict instructions. I hope you like the color. It's very patriotic." The next 3 months were a legal circus. Steve tried everything. He tried to have the city declare the house a public nuisance. The city inspector came out, looked at the house, laughed, and told Steve that patriotism isn't a nuisance. He tried to fine me $500 a day, but my lawyer filed an immediate injunction, pointing out that the fines were arbitrary and capricious since no specific color ban existed in the bylaws. But the real victory didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened in the neighborhood. For 15 years, Steve had ruled through intimidation. But now the flag house had become a symbol. If I could stand up to him, anyone could. A week after my house was finished, Bob across the street painted his front door a bright, unapproved yellow. A few days later, another neighbor put up a non-standard birdhouse. Steve tried to send notices, but he was overwhelmed. The uniformity he loved so much was crumbling. Eventually, the HOA board realized that Steve had become a liability. His obsession with my house was costing the association thousands of dollars in legal fees. In a special meeting, one that I attended with a smug grin, the board voted to remove Steve as president. The new board approached me with an olive branch. They offered to drop all legal action if I would agree to paint the house back to a neutral color. I told them I would consider it, on one condition. The board had to sign a Residents' Bill of Rights. This document officially limited the HOA's power over minor aesthetic choices and explicitly allowed the display of national flags. They signed it. I did eventually paint the house back to a nice, quiet morning sand beige. I didn't want to live in a flag forever. I just wanted to prove that I could. But I kept the garage door painted with a small, subtle red and white stripe on the inside, where only I can see it. And every time I drive into my neighborhood, I don't see a beige prison anymore. I see a place where the rules finally belong to the people, and where Steve, who now has to follow my Bill of Rights, has to keep his clipboard to himself. Malicious compliance isn't just about being annoying. It's about taking the weapons of a bully and turning them into the tools of your own freedom. So next time your HOA tells you that your grass is a half-inch too long, buy a ruler. And then buy some paint.